From there, should I speak over here? Or?
Yeah. Thank you.
Alright. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Judge is ready?
Yeah.
Team ready?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first thing that I want to explain is that what are the actors' incentives, Prigozhin's incentives. I think there are 4 important things that I want to talk about here. I think the first is that this particular individual literally formed the Wagner group. He has always been the leader. This means the entire Wagner group is like a baby. This person has parasocial relationships with this entire team, has a sense of camaraderie with this entire team. This means this entire group is very close to this particular person's soul, and anything that threatens the Wagner group and its existence is antithetical to the interest of this particular individual. These are paramilitary forces who really care about their independence, who really care about their entire group to begin with. But 2, we think the ultimate incentive is literally power and autonomy. This individual wants to be taken seriously. That is why he literally formed the entire paramilitary group to begin with. He wants financial and social autonomy, and he wants to continue the operations the way the Wagner Group has continued operations in different countries. Actually, is a profitable venture, wants to go for the highest bidder and has monetary incentives as well. But thirdly, this person has esteem needs. This person thinks very highly of themselves and does not like anyone controlling them. To have the freedom what you want as a paramilitary leader is one of the most proximate interests of this actor. But fourthly, we think currently the Wagner Group and this actor has a lot of animosity with the Russian government. The reason for this is that firstly, that the entire Wagner Group does not agree with the government's operations, for example in that of Ukraine, and has actively dissented and spoken against this thing to begin with. But number 2, the very idea that you literally had a coup and literally march in Russia, the very idea you can conceptualize this thing to begin with, to actually take such an extreme action, implicitly explains is that you probably are not very good friends with the Russian government at the very first place to begin with. We think at the end, because I explained to you that freedom is something which is the most valuable for this particular person, we think the team is actually able to preserve the autonomy of this individual, and the autonomy of this entire group which he cares about the most is the team which wins, because this is the most important part to victory for our team to begin with. That. Argument 1. Why the terms of contracts that have been signed are bad and why do we regret the same? To explain what do these terms of contracts look like, I think it looks like 2 things. So basically you have had an option either to relocate to Belarus or to sign defense contracts with Russia. I'm going to explain why both of these options are bad. Firstly, why signing contracts with the Russian government is bad. This is because of 4 structural reasons. A. I think the terms of contracts are likely going to be based by Russian government and the interests of the Ministry of Defense of Russia, because Russia is literally pushing the deal on you, meaning your say and ability to negotiate is actually very less to begin with in the very first place, meaning what are the incentives that you actually want won't be able to be pushed at the very first place. But 2, it actually looks like integrating with Russian forces, which is literally shadowed in the context slide. We think this is bad because now you actually have close association with the military, meaning you literally have to give up on your independent plans, you have to give up on your own operations, you have to give up on an entirely basis, because now you have to coordinate and have activity with the military force, with the Russian government. This means the entire idea of actually acting as an independent power, of actually deciding this is where my next operation will be, deciding that this is what my next target will be, that actually having independent deals with different kind of bidders ceases to exist. This takes away the independence of the group to begin with. But thirdly, we think this is also against your ideology, because we think that you never actually agree to the ideology of Russia's government. You don't want to be a puppet of the Russia's government, because it's antithetical to the ideology, and a lot of people generally join these paramilitary forces and not the normal military defense is because the ideological inclination is antithetical to what the interest of the government is. This means because it's against your ideology and these people truly care about their ideology, we think this contract is bad. But fourthly, you can also be coerced into future contracts easily, primarily because now you actually get into the funnel. Once you're inside the funnel, we think their government's ability to coerce you is even more, because they've already agreed to an agreement, right? You've already started working with them. Once you actually get with them, we think you can actually get coerced into future contracts, and we think this is generally bad for their independence to begin, right? But what is option 2? The option 2 is exile to Belarus. Why is this bad? This is because of a couple of reasons. I think the first reason to say under this is that Lukashenko is literally the puppet of Putin, right? This is true because Belarus is literally economically dependent, politically and socially dependent on Russia to begin with. A lot of Russia's pipelines literally flow by Belarus, and we think that Belarus literally acts as a proxy state of Russia, and Russia can literally do do anything, can literally command anything to the Belarus leader to begin with. The conclusion of this mechanism is that you won't be able to operate independently, which I've explained is the primary interest of this Wagner group and this particular actor to begin with that. The second mechanistic reason is that there are tons of logistical issues. To set up in an entire country is just generally very difficult because you have to set up shop, you have to get domestic connections, you have to get spies, you actually have to get acquaintances with a lot of people locally which you don't have currently. This means to actually have that fear, to actually tell people that who we are, to actually have that estimate that we're literally a paramilitary group and you can't fuck with us, you can't mess with us. I think the entire idea that you are above us and you're not beneath anybody, it takes time, and we think this has happened in Russia to begin with. To entirely move to your country is generally bad. But the third mechanistic reason is that people start to quit Wagner group because the context, let's say, is that the condition is that Wagner group also should relocate to Belarus. Why a lot of people can't quit after this? The first reason, a lot of people generally have incentives to stay close to their families because people love their families. A lot of people generally join paramilitary forces is because they don't have a lot of money and they don't actually don't have alternative financial options. Primarily because paramilitary forces pay really well. We think that this explains is that a lot of people have monetary incentives so they can give back to their family. We think to stay close to their families is a very important incentive for a lot of people to begin with. The second thing to say here is that a lot of people see that Wagner group is getting weaker, and we think a lot of people see this is because once you succeed to the demand and of literally going to Belarus, we think this is generally bad for a lot of people in terms of perceptual value of where the group is going in terms of further trajectory. This explains is that a lot of people quit Wagner group. This is bad for the actor because this actor literally recruited them. This actor literally sees them as their son. Literally sees them as important people and wants to see their interests as well. We think once people start quitting, we think the entire sanctity of the Wagner group also decreases because we think the degree of strength that you also have also decreases to begin with that. But fourthly, we think this can also be an indefinite exile because we don't have any reason to believe that when can you come back or if you can ever come back to begin with. This is also bad because in terms of the perceptual value, to actually be indefinitely relocated into some places is something that is very bad, and therefore we think it's completely against the actor, and we think the actor should have never agreed to the terms of contracts. What is the counterfactual and why the counterfactual is better? Firstly, counterfactual looks like you continue to stay in Russia. We think you continue to maintain your autonomy. You don't succeed to the demands of the particular deal that you were given. We think you continue with your coup. You continue with your operations because you believe that you can actually succeed to begin with that. But also, we think you put pressure on Russia. You maybe shoot a plane. You maybe put pressure on Russia onto different fronts. We think you have the domestic capability and the technical expertise to actually do that, primarily because you have stayed and you have operated since literally a lot of time to begin with. If Russia actually gets very fierce, if that's an if condition, then we think you can for your own strategic incentives you can literally get cooler a little bit and then stop, and so basically you do that strategy to begin with that. Except why in the counterfactual you are likely going to succeed in terms of that Russia won't give you the worst kind of harm. This is true because of 5 structural reasons. Firstly, we think you get tons of funding from oligarchs who are pissed with Putin. We think a lot of oligarchs are pissed with Putin because they think that Putin's policies are anti-Putin, etc., etc. We think you continue to get that funding, and money is important because money allows you to buy weaponry, allows you to recruit people. Therefore, we think you can maintain that. But 2, people are dodging the Russian draft because many people don't agree with Russia's policies about intervention in Ukraine. This means you have a lot of good pool with technical expertise to join your Wagner group. This means you actually get the man force from the people who are actually dodging the Russian draft because all they know is literally how to fight, and we think you give them an avenue. But third, you get Western funding because NATO wants an opening. We think that Putin's existence threatens Baltic states' boundaries and threatens the entirety of NATO. We think West is looking for groups which takes Russia from inside, because to take Russia from outside is generally very difficult. But fourthly, you have experience of territory, you have lived there, you have spies, you have people who support you, you have people who can help you go underground. But lastly, Russia's capacity to harm you a lot is also very less to begin with because resources of Russia are actually getting less. We think Russia is literally losing the Ukraine war. We think there's a lot of domestic backlash in terms of a rise of unemployment, etc. to begin with. We think to maintain independence, to actually continue to choose the kind of operations we want, is the biggest incentive of this actor. And the biggest incentive of this actor is literally to have the Wagner group stay intact. We think it can only stay intact on the very top of the list. Thank you.
I thank the first affirmative speaker for that speech and welcome the first negative speaker to begin the case for the opposition bench. Here. Probably thinking of what happened. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Think of it like a movie, and your Prigozhin is the main character, and you're being betrayed by someone who is more powerful than you. Then I think that the best thing that you wish for is time and space for you to build up plans, for you to strengthen your Wagner family forces, for example, for you to build up preparation. So one time, if you want to fight back, you have the capital to fight back. Because the status quo wasn't good. You were being harassed and you were being tackled down by the Russian government. I'm going to do a couple of things here. First, I'm going to do framing, and I'm going to characterize the counterfactual in affirmative, because it's kind of like in the 6 minutes of PM speech and assured strategy. But lastly, I'm going to tell you it's important for you to be able to have plans and time to make your next move, and I'm going to win on counterfactual. 2 framing things to be. One, this is a debate on hindsight. Our burden of proof in team negative is only to prove to you why the agreement was strategic at that time, in the current time when we were on this agreement with Russia. When all the Wagner troops were about to die by Russia's, prosecution, for example. When you're afraid that you yourself is gonna die, for example, because you are going against the Russian government at that time. So we don't have to prove why it's gonna be longly sustainable, just like why at the time we need to survive this. But secondly, what will happen in their side are worse? Because A is either that you lose on the prosecution, you die, you get poisoned just like Navalny, for example, by Putin, for example, or 2, okay, somehow let's assume that it's good, that you're gonna, Russia is gonna be able to invite you to join their official military forces if they think that you're that smart, for example, which is gonna prove to you why is that against our moral ground as Prigozhin, and you want like that to begin with. But one counterfactual categorization in their side. What they wanted to do is to continue the code without explaining 2 things. One, why would the Wagner forces would have the incentive to do so? Because they rely on the analysis that those forces want to fight back, for example. They did not tie it with the prosecution that was so big at the time. They were not afraid of losing their families and their lives at the time. But secondly, it's also dependent on the idea of success, on why would the code be successful at the time. We said it won because of 2 reasons. One, I think that be realistic. Your independent entity going against a full military country, for example, is one of the strongest 3 countries on military outside like US and China. Meaning that you're going to get a huge sentiment from Putin and the minister, for example, for sharing the agenda to the people that they were doing it wrong on Ukraine's conflict. But secondly, you're also going to get a country that has connection with other countries like China, for example, where your private entity doesn't have any relation, you don't have any backup, US probably don't care about you, meaning that you're alone in this fight, for example, you're likely to suffer at that time. I think the logic is Prigozhin was so confident at the time, then he would also continue with the code, for example. The fact that he agreed to this means that at the time there wasn't huge confidence for him to be able to make this code, because he was afraid that he would die, or all the military forces that he had put up for years in the Wagner family would be gone to begin with. Now I'm going to go on to arguments now. One, what is important for you to be able to make your next move? One, this is an electromotion. It's within that Prigozhin should be also psychologically analyzing this motion. Prigozhin, I think, far from this group under the smart mind of contingency plan, meaning that he's unlikely to do things that are not strategic for him and his own military forces. Meaning that realistically, one, he knew that at the time if he continued to riot, then it's very easy for him, a single man, for example, to be killed by Putin and his military forces. But secondly, he also knew that everything that he had been built up for years could have be erased in one time, for example, in blink of an eye, if Putin wanted to do that, for example. That's why he signed a deal to have time and space to think about that. So secondly, what did the Prigozhin had then at the time after all this process of years, for example, of signing up to this deal? He had 2 things. One is the politic change of Russia's government itself, because now in the status quo, you see Russia is not getting any stronger than before. I.e. how Ukraine keeps getting a lot of backup from US, for example, $400 million being sent to give the military tanks whatsoever. making it to be long-standing. For example, the fight is still continuing, meaning there is a lot of sentiment from the domestic people, for example, saying that you just need to stop. Why do we need that much when we have to spend all of that military tank whatsoever to begin with? But secondly, we say that what you also have is time, right? It's time for two things. One, preparing for the war, i.e. preparing how to do the propaganda, for example, if you want to go St. Petersburg, for example, to tell the people that your government is shit, for example. But secondly, it's also how you have the time to strengthen your military forces, for example. So if the court help us again in the next time, you won't lose this time. You have be confident in that sense. But what are we gonna do then in the St. Petersburg at the time in last night, right? We did two things. One, we try to build up our propaganda here to tell those people that the minister and also Putin, for example, have been so bad in regulating their plans or counterbalancing Ukraine, for example, to tell them all the things that the government did to him was also unstrategic, so bad, right? Meaning that we want to go in this. One, we want to shape their mind on how the rationality of defense, Putin's decision were not strategic to continuing the fight with Ukraine, for example, to also get our legitimacy as a group getting back on the ground in Russia. But secondly, also fight for the peace of the Wagner forces, because a lot of people have been dying our military forces under that time of hope before it ended. Meaning we wanted some sort of apology, some sort of a better sensitivity from Russian government in that sense. And we said it's likely. Because the reason why we went to St. Petersburg, not to Moscow, which one of the two capitals of Russia, was that because the people in St. Petersburg haven't been that exposed, for example, for the Putin's ideas and agendas on military forces. Because it's not on Moscow that has all of these military bases to begin with. Near people, or you have this progressive mind, for example, that probably war is not strategic. That what we have to care for is the domestic people on their side of the house. So it's hard for us to be able to internalize all this propaganda to the people in St. Petersburg. But I'm going to say that the counterfactuals in their side are also two things on this comparative. One, when you fail at the COP, then presumably you were about to die, and all the Wagner forces were about to die also. Meaning that all the Wagner forces that you have built up for years, for example, under your passive optimistic mind would just erase in one moment. But secondly, even if you could cooperate as military officer, if Russia wants you that bad, it's not within your personal interest, because the reason why you make this up, you want it to be private, and the team means that you don't want any ideologies whatsoever. And secondly, you're going to have backlash from Wagner group. They're not afraid they're going to die in the war, in the COP itself. But what we're going to say is that on the idea on ideology of the deal, I wonder what ideology they mean. Because the fact that the Wagner group is a private entity means that there is no strong incentive for them to build up the ideology to begin with. Because if they're true, Prigozhin will just choose to be military officer in some country, for example, rather than building up all military forces as a private entity. But secondly, we say that ideology is at best symmetrical in their side of the house. Because in their side, they have to continue this hope with no legitimacy, with no certainty that they would win anyway. And we say that ideology is only good when you win, and ideology is good when you can stand as a private entity to begin with, so it's going to be better on their side of the house. We said it is good. We take the trade off, even if we don't succeed that much, at least we already have time to build up our military forces. We have time to build up the propaganda, to talk about the people here, the patients, and for us to make it easier to win, proud to begin.
I think the first Negative speaker for that speech, and welcome the second affirmative speaker to begin. Continue the case with the affirmative team here.
Alright, starting 3, 2, war. There's an enormous friction between the Wagner Group and the Russian government at this point, what we essentially explained to you, in terms of them literally marching towards Moscow and literally Prigozhin asking the Russian Minister of Defense to resign and had ambitions to become Russia's Minister of Defense subsequently. We would note that the only push that this negative team has is if you don't accept the deal, you would be killed. This is unclear simply because if Russia was so powerful and what essentially wanted to kill you, it would have done it either way. It literally poisoned Alex Navalny and essentially wanted to kill any kind of opposition that essentially existed. Which means to say something was such a grave threat to the existence of the Russian state in that regard, which it was because this person was literally marching towards Kremlin. In that regard, Russia would have taken that act and essentially trampled you down. Because this argument is so unintuitive. Because say for example, that's the reason why Israel does not negotiate with Palestine, because it's asymmetrically so powerful. It can clamp down opposition pointed which way it wants to, or essentially it can literally eliminate your existence if it wanted to. So in that regard, I'm very unclear in terms of why, if Russia was asymmetrically so powerful, why it won't have gone ahead and trampled over this aggression and this this so-called revolution and literally come to the table. Which essentially meant that this revolution had the potential of essentially creating at least, say for example, a social narrative around, like say for example, the existence and so-called the invincibility of Putin, or at best it was capable enough of essentially doing real damage to the Russian autonomy largely in general. That's why Putin felt that there was a need to come to the table and essentially renegotiate this, because if there was, like say for example, if they were so, because if the Russian state was so powerful, I'm pretty sure they would have gone ahead and killed them either way. So in that regard, I'm not sure why this is something like in that regard, this is something that Russia won't have been able to do. Second thing that they say is in terms of why in terms of why ideology is not that important and winning essentially is. One, in terms of the narrative shift that they talk about in terms of why you can realign forces in St. Petersburg and people will listen to you and all of that with your so-called briefing. The reason why the briefing is not likely to work is because one, you already seceded to Russian demands. That is to say, you already accepted the deal that was asymmetrically against you, which is to say you have lost your legitimacy anyway in the eyes of the people when you have already given away to Putin's demands, which is pointed with that even if they brief people, the Russian state could automatically push the counter agenda and say, well, just because they accepted to our demands and just because we were able to coerce them at that point of time into those deals, just we would be able to coerce them subsequently in the future as well. So the precedent that you set at this point of time becomes like the Achilles heel in future negotiations that you want to do, which is to never have that narrative control because you already gave in to Russia's demands at this point of time. So the amount of narrative control and the perceptual image that you have gets really dented point at which when you do this. But secondly, when they say ideology is more ideology is as good as we win, point at which we think these people went ahead and joined the Wagner Group, essentially formed a part of the alternate organization that joining the Russian military. I'm pretty sure they had that amount of conviction and valor to opt into this. But secondly, this is largely about Prigozhin, who essentially literally created the Wagner Group and essentially has very strong ties with it, but also has personal ambitions at the end of the day. So it means this person definitely values ideology at that point of time. If you even conceptualize the demand of going towards Moscow, which means at that point of time, probably this is something that is comparatively incredibly important. But even in the worst case scenario, I think if you subtract, because when you lose the amount of ideological narrative control, at that point of time it's very difficult for you to build it up subsequently. Even if, say for example, few people die on that side of the house, we're not sure when Prigozhin himself dies, even if a few people die, you're willing to bite the bullet and say that at least the consistency of ideology of the Wagner Group is something that's maintained, that's important for your future ambitions and aspirations, and even for Prigozhin largely in general. But even if the leaders themselves die, I don't think they have any utility staying in Belarus and staying in exile in the first place, because I'm not sure why they would be able to freely conduct their operations in St. Petersburg if this deal actually works, so they can't influence you on that side. Which is your existence anyway in exile is not going to do much. So in that regard, I'm not sure what that delta largely looks like. Two things that are on our side of the house. One in terms of autonomy, why that's the most important thing for Prigozhin to essentially maintain. But before that, I think why the Wagner Group essentially has the capacity to resist this, and secondly why Russia won't be able to coerce you subsequently in the future. One, I think, as Robin says, firstly in terms of the huge amount of oligarchs who are right now pissed at Putin in the first place to begin with. So for a few reasons, in terms of their essentially assets largely being frozen by Western sanctions, or their inability to do deals and get money, or essentially make business transactions in the way that they have essentially been able to. A lot of Russians who own businesses, say for example Roman Abramovich, all those people had to step down from their holdings in the Western countries simply because of the amount of the kind of things Putin has been doing. So on a very utilitarian level, these oligarchs have lost money and have lost the power and influence in Russian society society. At that point of time, they're really pissed at Putin, who would essentially fund an alternate group. That's what Wagner claims in terms of getting funding from oligarchs who are not in tune with the Kremlin at this point. But secondly, in terms of people who have dodged the draft, and these individuals who don't want it to be a part of the Russian military, these are people who are largely opting into them. But thirdly, also is in terms of like Western funding from NATO, which we think is more likely to happen, simply because like NATO has largely been hit in terms of the war that has happened, in terms of its energy prices soaring over the roof. But of course, the war poses a threat because Ukrainian refugees are literally entering into the Schengen area in terms of the borders of Hungary and, say, for example, like Hungary and these countries, which literally would create a refugee crisis in Europe. Which means in this regard, Europe would want the war to stop at the earliest and would essentially fund a group that is more likely to go ahead and do so and create that internal rebellion. Why is this important for you to create this internal rebellion sense of autonomy? Because one, this undercuts Putin's narrative directly. Because point at which Putin says that it's a war versus us against the West, and internal rebellion is something that is more difficult for you to justify to your people when the Wagner group itself does it. But secondly, which means you get more amount of support from these groups and get access to the narrative control on our side of the house. Which means in those regards, it's more like easier for you to get that sense of capacity to keep fighting. And on our side of the house, the counterfactual you told is pretty simple. It's renegotiate the deal. I mean, like ask for the Ministry of Defense to resign, or essentially get better terms and conditions for you that like accepting this deal. I mean, there are multiple deals that have happened historically. Like even if this takes more time, even if like this essentially is prolonged, we still feel that's better than losing your sense of ideology and sense of autonomy. Why is that important in terms of autonomy? Because one, you've already splintered your forces. Because point at which when you sign defense contracts with Russia, the amount of economic gains that you gain are largely undercut. This looks like economic operations that they do largely in Africa in terms of resource extraction and getting money from those sources. I'd say, for example, like using that to train their own military academies. Which means to say when you tie up with the Russian government, at that point of time you take they're much more likely to take an economic cut out of the revenue that you generate. But secondly, in the long run, this largely means dissolution of the Wagner group. This means that now you have to like train with the Russian army. You have to integrate within the Russian apparatus. Which means to say in this regard, you no longer can narratively but also pragmatically maintain the sense of autonomy that Wagner group wanted to, which is literally Prigozhin's first interest. But thirdly, this also means that point at which when Wagner group is exiled into Belarus, and a large chunk of it will be, and Prigozhin won't be able to move freely within the Russian Union, I'm pretty sure they have to like bite the bullet and concede that. Which means the amount of narrative control you have over the Wagner group and over the Russian people is largely limited. Because Prigozhin also wants to have narrative control because he has self-ambition. Like literally he stated he wanted to be the Russian Minister of Defense, if not come to power to Kremlin. Which is a personal image, and your long-time ambitions are largely hurt when you lose out on this narrative control. But this largely means that like movements are largely based on figureheads and people who people like ascribe to in terms of inspiration control. Which is point at which Prigozhin is no longer is exiled, and at that point of time you're not likely to get the person at the figurehead of the movement, which is the Wagner group, is more likely to disintegrate subsequently in the future. At the end of the day, if this is an actor motion about Prigozhin's interest, integrating with the Russia literally means that you lose the amount of use the narrative control. People don't take you seriously because Russia now literally can set the precedent and claim that because they have succeeded to this demand, they would do so in future operations. Thirdly, we told you why this is largely likely for your personal ambitions as an actor. Even if this like renegotiation takes a longer amount of time, even if few people die, we think maintaining the narrative control over the group is something that's most crucial in this round. For those reasons, affirmative.
Thank you to the second firm speaker for that speech, and welcome the second English speaker to continue the case of the opposition bench. ESL.
I think we can all agree that the defense contract with force of reasons from Personnel is out of debate because we agree it will not be aligned with their interest, right, to Prigozhin. However, the main substantive coming from Hazard is we stayed Belarus with structural responses. The only uncertainty coming from LO is Lukashenko is a puppet of Russia, which is really bad.
First off, I think it's very easy to counter with a simple rebuttal saying that Lukashenko is under scrutiny under Belarus itself. Because a lot of people already criticized him when he manufactured like the crisis border in Poland, like the European Union will have, for example, and care for like Belarus, for example. But those kinds of fabrication takes a lot of money coming from Belarus government, where they need to spend a lot of money on airplanes, spend a lot of money on the border, which means that a lot of people are already criticizing, and in society of Belarus already criticizing Lukashenko in the very first place. Which means that the opposition party from those kinds of countries is already very strong under that mindset. Which is why, on that regards, Lukashenko is already leaning towards Russia, sure, but they are not going to be in power in Belarus anymore, or those sorts of bargaining power will be lessened under Lukashenko, because he cannot do a more terrorist act, for example, immediately killing off someone is quite a huge deal under those kinds of deal, right? So I think it's better to live in peace under Belarus itself, and I think Prigozhin can still do that under ours of the house. But secondly, even if that's not true, I think the power to fight Lukashenko is lower than Russia, right? You could have better bargaining power, etc. I think it's far better for us to live in Belarus instead of just staying in Russia or being an active opposition party or opposition coup, which is actively destroying military power under Russia itself. So it's far better, right? Secondly, then let's talk about counterfactual. Government say we should continue the coup, and that's a good thing under there. One, I think that's not going to be possible. Sure, you have the sense of a sense of winning when you first start the coup because of the sense of shock, right? But I think that's not going to happen immediately, because now we understand that Russia is the top 5 military power that ever existed, so they do have certain power to worry to shut you down. But secondly, even if that's not true, I think they are very strategic in a certain way. For example, how they play in terrain, in Siberia and Ukraine, where the way that they win certain through certain things when a war happens is they win surrounding a certain enemy and then they go to war. I think exactly when that happens, your coup cannot be done by military power again on the second try when you do it again, because Russia knows that you're a correct and direct opposition party, where in the beginning they don't know that you're an opposition party and they don't know that you're going to do the coup. But on the second part, I don't think you're going to have much likelihood coming from negative for you to immediately succeed in the coup again, or succeed in winning against Russia, or whatever that could happen, right? But thirdly, crucially, I think the invasion with Ukraine is a huge thing. Because Russia wants to put priority on Ukraine and they want to immediately win, for example, on those sorts of things, they will immediately shut down any hassle that might come out. Which, because you are not a huge priority for Russia as of now, they really want to immediately shut you down because they don't want to have any externalities confusing them in the beginning or in the end when they fight Ukraine, for example. So I think it's very important for them to not sense or not trigger Russia from the time being, because they do want to have all their resources on a certain focus, for example. But lastly, I think on the our side of the house, Putin will not have necessarily aggression towards you on our side when you agree to the contract, because A, you will die already if you're in St. Petersburg and that moment, because the fact that Lukashenko already told you where you are located, you are presumably going to be immediately killed off even before you're in St. Petersburg or even before you're starting the coup. But secondly, I think again, he was already busy with Ukraine when you rebel, right? So those are the consolidation of power existed, because he's shocked, but the element of power of this kind of shock could only work so far. Exactly because under our side of the house, when you are not in a huge hidden part of enemy anymore, you are going to be more active in fighting against Russia. So you are going to be more active towards shutting down yourself, because you are not as much of a harm towards fighting Ukraine, with a lot of backing up power where you have none under yourself of the house. So it's far easier to immediately shut you down. But secondly, even if that's not true, and there are counter-proposals trying to have NATO to support you, right? I don't think that's going to happen because of 4 things. One, NATO doesn't really interfere inside of people's problems. They don't really interfere in civil wars. But secondly, they don't really trust you as a group, right? Because again, you're already seen as a rebellion, for example. You are not seen as a very good, a morally high ground level of an organization. So I don't understand why NATO will immediately give all the resources towards you. But thirdly, I don't think you have any interest to fight with NATO itself. Exactly because, and lastly, again, with NATO, you also lost your ideologies of trying to fight the coup by your own and trying to be the most having this certain leader or thinking highly of themselves. Exactly the characterization coming from First Night, right? I think this is a dangerous claim coming from Second Night, because A, you lost ideologies which is their main claim, but secondly, you cannot win without NATO, which is their likelihood. So you also lose the coup or lose the war with Russia under their side of the house. But secondly, then, let's talk about ideologies. One, the Prigozhin care about those kinds of ideologies and the military forces, right? I don't think that's true, because why would they care about these ideologies? Because if there's no coup, then there's no ideologies, right? I think under those kinds of logic, those kinds of ideologies will not happen, because they also care about their family, for example. They also care about each other. So I think that's not what the ideology is the main claim on. What they care about is trying to be safe, because without you, your soldiers, and without Prigozhin, there's no ideology for you to survive on. But secondly, those kinds of ideologies, what they say, is contingent on them winning, on them winning the coup and winning Russia, right? But from first neck and second neck, there's no likelihood on why they could win the war. Exactly, from NATO, we already pushed that out. It's not going to happen. So I don't understand why they could win on ideology, or why they could win on one-on-one against Russia anyway. But for that, let's talk about let's talk about the logistical issue in Belarus, right? You want to talk about how people can tell who we are, and people cannot tell who we are, and they cannot shut up shop and family, etc. I think people already know who we are. Like you are a huge deal, right? You are an organization. You are actively criticizing him in the past. We already know who you are. But secondly, there's a reason for you to go to St. Petersburg, because I think the main interest of Prigozhin in the very beginning is to spread out propaganda, right? To talk about how Russia is not a good actor, because the moment when Russia is trying to invade against Ukraine, everyone in Moscow say that they are trying to defend Russia because Ukraine is a neo-Nazi that's going to fight against you. That's how Russia is going to win and how they can gain supporters, right? But exactly because you can go to St. Petersburg, because you can stay in Belarus, you can fight in your own deed inside of those kinds of community, where you can talk about your experience, for example. You can actively criticize the Minister of Defense without having Russia to having a tail on you when you are an active opposition party under their side of the house. Exactly because under our side of the house, when you already have when you already agree towards this kind of contract towards Russia and Belarus, it's far easier for you to think as you're a neutral part of society, for example, or you're not actively being aggressive. And because of that, Russia will not have huge priority against you. They want to fight against Ukraine, for example, or other certain rebellion forces that happen. So as an actor itself, you have far easier time for you to spread against the propaganda, for example, or spread against people on the community saying what has Russia done to you and why Russia is actually bad. It's far easier under our side for you to do that. But secondly, again, with family, I think because you're in a rebellion, presumably, you already sent your family far away from that, and secondly, you just don't care if you don't do that because that's not in interest of actor anyway. So all in all, I think under our side, we want to talk about how Prigozhin soldiers is a very integral part of him. I think government will say how St. Petersburg things happen and how you can be caught on that and you can be killed. Again, you can see that a few weeks ago. That will not happen. On worse, if you can get caught by Russia under our side, on both sides you will be killed anyway. It's symmetric. But secondly, you will still have protection. Exactly because of the soldiers that are loyal to you, they are more likely to protect you. But lastly, I think you also have the morally guide for you to protect your soldiers back, right? Which is why I feel you have more likely for you to accept this contract, because it's important for you to protect your soldiers as well, who are already indebted and very loyal to you. But again, I think for all in all, once you want to talk about the integral part of the motion, once you are regretting the contract or not, exactly because of during those kinds of moments, it's very important for you to immediately accept it for the time being. I feel it's very good for you to negate.
Thank you to the second negative speaker for that speech. And to finish off the substantive portion of the government bench case, I welcome the Conservative member to speak here.
Alright. Starting in 3, 2, 1. It's better to die as a hero than to live long enough to see yourself become the villain. That is the issue that they don't understand, because that's the wing we'll give you from third after this debate, right? If you're a paramilitary person who probably joined the military, you probably left a lot of luxuries you could have gotten from a regular job. You probably entered the paramilitary because you had certain ambitions in mind. You probably wanted to assert power, control the narrative, and actually gain more resources, more power under your control at any point of time, because you wanted to fulfill your ambitions. And you lived in shitty conditions across the world, where you went ahead and did war crimes in Egypt and all those kind of countries. When you went there, it probably means that your ambitions, your identity as as a paramilitary member matters more to you as an individual as opposed to a comfortable lifestyle that they probably say that will exist on their side, where you might get certain resources by staying in Belarus. The reason why I'm telling you this is very simple. This weighs up our worst case, that even if you go ahead and die on the counterfactual, that you go for the coup and you still die, at least the narrative still remains in your control, and you never see it to the demands of what the Russian government's forced contract was on to you at any point of time. On our side, the counterfactual is pretty simple, right? You do two things. One, you probably just stay as is. You probably don't go ahead and like get the same kind of like demands pushed forward, or you don't enter any sort of negotiation which is brokered by Belarus. But secondly, even if you take a worst case and say that even if you continue with the coup, I think it's still fine, because Russia came to the table to sign this agreement at the first place, or the conceptualization of this motion statement in of itself happened because Russia came to the table and asked Belarus to broker a deal between their government and the Wagner Group. It's because Russia is actually threatened by the existence of the Wagner Group. If they were really so fuckless and they could have done anything, the moment you stepped into Moscow, they would have shot you down or bombed you. But they didn't do it because they know that they need you in the first place to push things like, you know, war crimes in Egypt and still maintain like plausible deniability as Russia has always done. We are giving you structural reasons of why, even if you are being hired by someone as powerful as Russian military, it's still not likely to fuck you in a way, over in a way that they posit. There are 5 reasons to tell you this. Firstly, you came to the table. That means you still want to have some more negotiation with the Wagner Group. Secondly, the Russian capacity currently is much lesser, primarily because countries have stopped importing oil from Russia after the Ukraine war had happened, because a lot of sanctions that US and other countries imposed on Russia. But also, the war prolonged for so long beyond what Russia had planned for, and that means that the war has depleted a significant chunk of resources from Russia at any point of time. Thirdly, the Putin still needs you again, like I said, to maintain the plausible deniability and distance itself politically from actions like war crimes and infringements of the Geneva Convention that Russia already does and is doing with refugees and like prisoners of war in Ukraine, right? But lastly, I think when you would, like I said, you probably would have done it anyway, you're not doing it. But lastly, the narrative would shift for Russia if they go ahead and they kill you in any points of time. Because now the war won't be between Russia and the West, the war will be between Russia and someone who's probably looking out for Russian people's interests. That means the narrative shifts when you crack down on an organization which is saying that the Russian war was not, Russian invasion into Ukraine was not justified as per the motion context, right? At that point of time, the internal fragmentation that exists within the Russian political system would increase so much because of the narrative shift now that happens, that Russia still has incentives to not fuck you in a way that they deposit on their side of the house, right? And this is where we say that even if you die, it's still something that's better off. But what is the claim that they give on their side of the house? And this is what I want to fact check them, right? They said Lukashenko in Belarus is facing a political opposition. The base opposition leader in Belarus is currently in exile in Estonia. I'm not really sure they have a political party to oppose Lukashenko's insane dictatorial regime at any point of time. Secondly, they say NATO doesn't fund groups because some groups are unreliable. They literally funded Afghani Mujahideen when they wanted to take over like communist control from Afghanistan back in 1990s. They also funded like Contras in Nicaragua because they want to take over like whatever the Sandinista government was there. They also fund like rebel groups across South America when they wanted to do the war on drugs. So I'm pretty sure NATO uses these proxies to go ahead and push their agenda and take over military regimes and push groups which will favor them. So insofar as you give them any opening into Russian military or Russian political systems, they will actively fund you, because now you're not just a rebel group who sprung out of like people's own volition, because you're literally a fucking paramilitary group with weapons and resources and tactical strategy and all those kind of things. That means you're a much more stable actor for NATO to fund, because now they can break Russia internally, but people's support is also there because this group is looking out for the people's like sort of validation, as opposed to like NATO trying to push a military offensive onto Russia, which would create a narrative that NATO is trying to infringe Russia's sovereignty. That doesn't happen. That means NATO has incentives to fund you anyway on our side of the house, right? When you don't go for this deal. So I don't think that idea that NATO doesn't fund you is something that's true. But then they say you probably won't win the coup. The problem is that we took this worst case from second half onwards. We told you that even if you don't win the coup, the narrative remains still in your control. So even if you die and there's someone else who takes up the Wagner group, your ambition of killing the Wagner group still stays intact, because the identity ascribed to it is something that you want absolute control and don't want to be someone's puppet. Because if you actually wanted to be someone's puppet, you probably would have defeated the Russian army anyway. But you didn't do that because you wanted to separate your identity from the Russian army, and you wanted to do things that even if were out of bounds for the Russian army itself. So that identity still remains intact on our side of the house, even if you go ahead and die. But then they say that negotiating with the Belarus government is only going to be better if you take that side of the deal, which is the deal that I talked about. To two reasons why they don't tell us why that's good. Firstly, I'm not entirely sure why the Belarus government's initiatives and say their objectives of like the world power geopolitical stage is something that's aligned with the Wagner Group at any point of time. I think Russia or Wagner Group is still sort of aligned in ideology because they're expansionists and they want to take over resources of other countries, and like it's just like taking up mining in coal mines in Egypt and all those kind of things, and taking those resources, plundering those resources and all those kind of things, right? So why is Belarus government and the Wagner Group aligned in a way that they'll go ahead and sit at a negotiating table and give immense amounts of control to the Wagner Group? But secondly, capacity is something that they don't prove, and this is where we tell you what the positive looks, what the like arguments are on Russia's house. They do two things. What the actor wants. Firstly, the actor wants autonomy. Secondly, the actor wants money and resources. Four things are autonomy. One, we tell you that when you go ahead and shift to Belarus and you like send your entire base from Russia to Belarus, of course the transitioning period will probably take a lot of opportunity costs for people who are already involved in the Wagner Group. That means they have to overcome things like family barriers or even anything that's established within their own friend circle, community groups to shift to a new country altogether. This means forces probably splinter. Also because forces splinter because you have changed the narrative from you being someone who's like complete autonomy over their own ideology as opposed to someone who conceded to Russian demands at any point of time. So you probably have lesser forces, and secondly, you probably conceded that you did something wrong. So the people's support also is not the same anymore. This means that you probably don't get the same amount of oligarchy funding that you currently got as a group. But thirdly, you are exiled, so the ability to collect resources in a new country where you create new networks and create resources and all those kind of things is also much lesser. But lastly, the idea that the precedence of you bending over to Putin means that the people don't strongly believe in the Wagner Group anymore because now they're like it can be pushed by the Russian government to concede to more and more demands. This means the autonomy goes down. That means the capacity for this person of this group itself goes down. So even if they get some capacity in Belarus on their servers, I'm not entirely sure why it's meaningful enough that it can retain the same amount of power that you currently hold, that it can march into one of the world's largest like economies capital and try to take over the government. That capacity is something that they never prove, even if they can prove some levels of self-sustenance, self-preservation in terms of life or all those kind of things which you already traded off. Secondly, money goes down because oligarchy foundry, which is literally capital flight moving out of Russia due to the war, and oligarchs not being in line with Russia's government, that funding goes down because now you see Russia's demand. But secondly, you don't get funding from Western organizations that you get on the comparative. But thirdly, Belarus being a proxy of Russia can literally control the kind of financing that you use or the kind of bank accounts you employ at any point of time. That means the ability for this person to create a new standing army in Belarus is much and much lesser. On our side, you preserve the narrative, you get the autonomy that you want to get, but you also get additional funding through NATO because that's exactly what Rishi Sunak said. That something big is going on in Russia, it's basically the Russian government going down, and that's why the NATO will fund you. All those reasons, insanely proud to have.
I think the third permanent speaker for that speech. Let's now finish off the substantive portion of the semi-final with the third negative speaker. Here.
Can it be held like this?
Yeah.
Wisdom is knowing when to step back to fight for another day rather than to die a fool's unwise death. There are three issues that I'm going to address in this speech to make sure negative wins. Number one, the urgency. Because this debate exists in a hindsight, i.e. the agreement was signed like a couple of weeks ago. And in hindsight, what do you want on June 2023? What we posit to you was two things. Number one, you probably really want to be alive. And you're unlikely to be alive in AF because we told you that the counterfactual, i.e. prosecution from Russia, will just probably look like Navalny randomly posted on a plane and you probably don't want to trust them. But I want to note that the jarring absence of a plausible counterfactual and affirmative loses them this debate because they say, we will continue the fight. We told you three reasons why this is unlikely to happen. Number one, factually the deal existed because you probably have no power left. And the response that we get from them was,
then Russia would have probably never signed a deal if they are probably stronger. I want to push the same thing. If it's true that you are stronger, then Russia would have probably replaced the minister already. I know that that's probably just a mitigation, but I think what that illustrates to you is just that their jarring lack of counterfactual is probably not enough to win them this debate. But secondly, what we told you in winning was that Russia is a top 5 strongest military country in the world. They have things like the right advantage. They would probably like to take the wars to like frozen areas in Siberia and stuff like that. And probably you cannot overcome their military in that position. But the last question they get was, you can rely on domestic oligarchs and NATO support. I want to flip this, and this is important, because Russia now will be able to flip the narrative and just say that you are an enemy of Russia, that domestic oligarchs will probably not want to support you anymore, because now you're actively attacking Moscow, and now you're actively attacking Kremlin, and now when everything that Putin does will be framed as a self-defense mechanism, that probably domestic oligarchs don't want to support you anymore. Insofar as if they support you, they're going to be seen as going against the majority population of Russia. But NATO, and it's very interesting that the Putin we get from third affirmative, which is to say that NATO acts in Nicaragua and South America. Number one, we told you that NATO are unlikely to intervene in some states, especially when they don't necessarily trust you. Then even in the best case, if you win and you become the president replacing Putin, NATO will probably not trust you rather than an actor that they probably predict in Putin. But secondly, and really importantly, when they argue that you want to fight for ideology, we suppose that it's even worse when you fight alongside NATO, which is much more different in ideology to you than Vladimir Putin. So even if you win, you will only become a puppet for NATO that presumably they don't want in their side of the house. They also don't want to fight with NATO in their side. So it doesn't really matter whether NATO will support you or not. What matters is the interest of the actor. If you really want to win by your own power, you probably don't want to take NATO's deal, even if they offer that to you. But note that even if they still be able to prove all this, it also does not prove that you will be alive. I.e., Putin's usual strategy is just to target the leader of the movement to take away the head of the snake, and therefore the rest of the rebellion falls. They argue that, but the fight continues, the spirit continues. I want to note that your existence as a military leader, you have a cult of personality, and that cannot be transferred to another particular actor. If you die, the fight dies, and therefore it's unclear to their side. Well, if you die, people will still likely to continue the particular fight, insofar as they see the tragic death that will happen in their side of the house. So it's not true that you will rather die and let the fight continue. You are the prerequisite of the fight to still exist. But the second thing that we pushed was that you probably don't want to join Russian military that you probably hate. So they try to claim that this was the term of the agreement. But not only that this is factually untrue, i.e. only the Wagner forces can join the military and you are not, and you're indefinitely exiled to Belarus as per the context slide. I encourage you to read that once more. I would suggest that the absence of this deal brokered by Belarus, Russia is more likely to force recruit you, i.e. because you're a very important actor, you're a brilliant tactician that they claim by themselves that you're really valuable to Russia, as in if they want to go attack in Egypt and stuff like that. So presumably the choice is either two things. One, Russia will either recruit you because you're valuable, or Russia will just kill you off because they're afraid of the threat that you probably pose. But it means that you either have to serve under a military officer that you don't trust, or you die. And this is independent debate winning. Because number one, at that time, what we want are those two things. Not only that you are quite irrational at that point, and probably that a feeling should be taken account of, but you also know that if you die or if you're recruited, you lose all the figures of power and charisma that will never be continued on either side. So the other particular future impacts are probably uncertain compared to this impact. But secondly, ideology is easily co-opted in our side. Insofar as you're still alive, you're still able to deliver your message of propaganda and stuff like that to your allies in Russia. Secondly, what happens to your paramilitary group that trains to be your deepest parasocial friends and comrades? We told you firstly that sending your friends to die is always the most difficult and the traumatizing action to do by a military strategist. They try to argue that you can still win. Even if not all die, some will die. And in the best case of you winning and you replace Shoigu or even replace Putin as a president, you get constantly reminded of their death as you sit and eat fancy foods. If it's true that they are truly your true friends, probably that means that the impact is multiplied. Because even if I win this debate at the expense of Hezron and Jones getting 71 in the speaker tax, I will still feel really bad. So presumably, if you take their logic of they being your friends, you probably cannot have that in their side. But secondly, do they really side with Russia totally? I'm not really sure, right? Because they will say remember their friend in you and the one who feed their families for a long time. I.e., even if they catch you at St. Petersburg, they are probably not going to snitch on you. The one who snitch on you are probably Lukashenko. And they're probably doing the same as you're doing, i.e., staying in hiding until the time is right for them to fight back. This is a much better and more believable characterization than just asserting that they will abandon you and forget you. Because they literally know that you exiled yourself, you signed a deal to save their lives, and that you are more believable than any Russian propaganda that would have probably received in their side of the house. What we told you in the second idea was that your comrades and your members of the Wagner group will probably still side on you in either side. The difference is in their side, they will not be alive anymore. Lastly, better likelihood going forward. But I want to note that the first two issues are already winning this debate. Insofar as the future impacts are probably secondary, predicated on uncertain futures. But even if you want to predict this, here's a prediction. Number one, we told you that life in Belarus will be okay. The push that we get from their side was that, Lukashenko is Putin's puppet. But this is really uncontextual, because the failure of the fabricated border crisis in attracting EU's attention, and therefore a total reduction of the quality of life, by spending much more money to put military on Poland's border, and manufacturing a whole refugee crisis, leads to massive distrust and the rise of opposition Democratic Party. The push that we got from third which is saying that, but the second opposition party is estranged to Estonia. It sounds to me like other parties will probably take its place if they know there's a democratic mandate, that this is a really good opportunity for them to consolidate power in order for them to win in the democratic election against a very weak Lukashenko that is probably a subject of a lot of scrutiny. The second push that they get was that you want freedom of movement and you want autonomy. You were found in St. Petersburg a fucking week after you signed the deal. It probably means that you can still, move around freely, probably just with a little fear that you will be caught. But anyway, you can still have that practical opportunity, right? So therefore, it's really unclear why you don't have this in our side, especially when we frame to you that you're loyal soldiers who sorry still be protecting you even if they are part of the Russian military. But lastly, and this is important, why can you continue to fight better in our side? I told you in my opening, wisdom is to know which method of the fight that you are going to adopt. You know that military fight is never going to work, because Putin can easily flip the agenda and say that you are Russian enemy. Because what happens in our side is that you continue to think like propaganda, because the reasons why you were in St. Petersburg probably is that you're spreading that spirit to people who, the general oligarchs that they claim to be your allies in their side, because they will continue to appreciate you. They know that you're not the opponents of Russia, you're the real Russian people who fight for the lives of the Russian people in our side. Because the last push that they get was that you're already seen as lost because you signed the deal. One, no, you are alive. And this is what happens in most belligerent movements worldwide. As long as the leaders are alive, you're still able to invoke hope. But that's where our counter mechanism exists. Because, to some extent, you can still go to St. Petersburg, you can still go to Russian borders with Belarus to influence the people to start scrutinizing Putin and to start questioning the legitimacy of the attack to Ukraine and stuff like that. What we claim to you was that not only that you will be alive, the fight can only rely on you as long as you're alive. Good day.
Alrighty, let's start the reply portion, starting with the negative reply. He's there.
Sorry, I had a second issue. Okay. 3, 2, 1. They say that reply to biased education, but I'm going to be biased. I'm going to place myself in your 5 shoes while even taking their bad case that they get ideology with a win or negative. So the first thing I want to note is on ideology. Even if you biased by 10 margin, we still win on winning. Why? Because what we told you is that A, ideology is only there and can be preserved when you are alive. We taught you that either you or the whole Wagner group would die in their sight. Not just that you cannot sustain your ideology in their sight, but you cannot even breathe in their side of the town. We taught you it's not just that the few people are dying as what TPM tried to argue, it's mostly a lot of people that were your shoulders. And we taught you that what matters is that, A, it's true that ideology is there when you feel solidarity with your common soldiers, then we'll tell you you'll have it. It's like, one of your roommates died in the war. It's like, one of the people that you probably don't know lose their family in the war. You can keep it as like, a fellow Wagner's group. But we also taught you that it's factually wrong if they say that, but those people care more about winning because that is what ideology is. read the context slide on the paragraph 3. It's completely written that there is a demand currently from at that time from the Wagner group that they need greater protection from their leader, for example. They want this, they want to survive. We say something that's factually correct and cannot be gathered under their side of the house. Secondly, we say that was under the idea, under the mind of the soldiers. We told you that even if as Prigozhin, you care for everyone there. Because A, you built this group by your own. You feel for every part of your identity is not just the strongest soldiers, those are those people on the ground, for example. You care for their livelihood, you care for them to survive. But secondly, we said that you also feel mad when you're being lied. But the thing is, you would be much more mad if you were lied and you couldn't win, for example. Which we told you that they were very contingent on them winning, which we thought you were unlikely. But we say that the only thing that stands under the house is that we will be helped by NATO. Several framings to kick this out. One, I think that it really came out in the left with speaker, telling about all the examples of the African group. And what we told you was that African group will only help because it's tied to the African countries that were vulnerable, for example. That NATO had the interest to help to. I think it's factually correct that everyone knows that NATO hit Russia for the war in Ukraine, for example. So the fact that even if the Wagner group is being related to Russia, then it's unlikely that NATO would help you suddenly to do this. But secondly, we tell you also that the thing is, even if NATO help, they still prove the likelihood of why NATO helping is symmetric with winning. They need to prove the likelihood of win over Russia to begin with. But the totally positive that is still unlikely. Because the fact that NATO tried to help Ukraine in the beginning of the invasion in Ukraine by Russia, but Russia wouldn't back down, shows you something. That Russia wasn't afraid of NATO, and even the Wagner group. At the end of the day, all the values cannot stand, meaning that this impact cannot manifest finals. But I think that the second thing that we told you is the interest of the Prigozhin itself. Which is we needed time to back down, to calm down, to reduce all the protests from our soldiers, for example, to tell them that everything's gonna be fine at the end of the day. What they told you was that when we don't do cope anymore, we'll stay in Belarus all the time and give up everything. One, read the context slide. We were in St. Petersburg last night. Of course, we were sipping coffee with our wife at that time, right? We were trying to make a propaganda. We told you what it's likely. They never engaged on that one. But secondly, we said that we also can still do something. The fact is a very private identity that Russia tried to own, for example, they were renting us, for example, for their invasion in Ukraine, means that it's still likely that we can work for other countries, for example. So we get this shut down in the current time, we're still going to be able to work. But the last time that we positive is that we preserve ideology in our propaganda is likely to succeed because people in the domestic power were already decreasing. They don't trust the government anymore. Most likely we're gonna succeed. We'll be engaged.
And now, final speech of the text, the affirmative reply. Here we go.
Alright, starting 3, 2, 1. The set then take us at our best and literally start the debate by saying, what if Prigozhin is killed? That is literally a worst case scenario. The best case scenario is he stays alive, he negotiates, gets better deals. So I don't think they do the way even if replies. Three things I want to do this. First, what premises you are more likely to buy. Secondly, what are the interests of the group, why they're better aligned on our side. Lastly, why those pragmatic outcomes happen. We told you why the Wagner group is substantial, and at that point of time, Russia does not have the ability to clamp you down. Three things we said from second. In terms of one, you get access to oligarch funding, which are literally placed with Russia because of Western sanctions and then losing capital, people like Roman Abramovich. Secondly, a lot of people are dodging the draft, essentially and opting either as refugees into Europe or getting into the Wagner group. Thirdly, we told you can get Western funding. So clearest reason we told you why NATO has interest. It's going to fund things that it is in its own interest. We told you why the Ukrainian war literally affects its energy resources, literally creates a refugee crisis at the border, and literally creates troubles for NATO. Once it does, it automatically is going to fund something that reduces that trouble. Unless adds those responses and will by saying that whatever which is done so in South America, done so in other parts of the world, it's acted on its own interest. That's the crux of the argument. That's why it's likely to do it. To this they say that perhaps it's not to this they don't substantially say apart from saying something that you're just going to do because ideologically you're not coherent, but the only winning metric is ideology doesn't matter, utilitarianism matters. The thing that literally undercuts the main principle premise that they have. You told me why Russia has the capacity, does not have the capacity to essentially do this. Firstly, the simple response, because if it was so asymmetrically powerful, it would have killed you anyway, like it poisoned Alex Navalny, and it can do so even in Belarus as well. So I'm just not too sure in terms of why Russia literally obliterating your existence can't happen, why it has come to the negotiating table. Why it came to the negotiating table is the reason we gave you. In terms of one, it's suffered crippled from financial crisis because of the Ukrainian war. A lot of oligarchs not essentially supporting it, but also because the war has been prolonged substantially longer. But most importantly, Russia's narrative of fighting the war is because the West is against us. Point at which is an internal rebellion. That narrative, it gets challenged at its very crux. That right now it's not the West versus us, it's also internally there's a problem. That's why they had to clamp that narrative down, and that's the reason they came to the table. Which means Russia is more likely to listen to you in this regard. That's the premise you have to buy in this round. Two things then in terms of autonomy, then in terms of money. We told you once simply why the Wagner Group cares about autonomy the most, because you have to have consistency in ideology and messaging. They said you can go to St. Petersburg and still go ahead and spread your message. Not required for you to militarily engage. Vote, it's a paramilitary group by default. So any way that is out of the round, because in terms of the contextual setup of this group, it's not a social movement through which you can do only messaging. Secondly, we told you what kind of messaging that happens. Russia tells you now that you already subscribe to our demands. You already seceded to the interest. You already clamped down, we could essentially like bog you down with these kind of deals. Which means that the kind of messaging you then go ahead and do is largely likely to be diluted, largely likely to be one that is not likely to be likely to be antithetical to your goals, and people are not likely to take you seriously. So you being alive and not being able to spread your message and galvanize troops, which means at the end of the day you won't be able to succeed in your demands. This happens because one, you're already exiled and you're not likely to essentially move more freely with Russia. But also which means that the Wagner Group largely loses support in the way that more people go ahead and leave the group, because now they don't see the legitimacy because we're working very closely with the Russian government, because the reason why people joined the Wagner Group is because they wanted something comparatively different. Three things then, point at which then if Lukashenko goes ahead and delivers the message, I think, at that point of time, Prigozhin keeps continuing delivering the messages they claim, which is, at that point of time, that will also be problematic in terms of Putin going ahead and obliterating you. I'm not sure what happens. But lastly, most importantly, they say that staying alive is the most important thing. They never weigh why this is the most important thing in the round. We told you specifically on third why this is not the most important thing. Because point at which when you joined the military, you already traded off certain amount of rights and luxuries that you were got. Secondly, you already have fought operations in Africa and other parts of the world, which is you as a soldier, they're used to the fact that you can die, point at which when you engage in war. But thirdly, this means that in this regard, when you march towards Kremlin and you essentially were ideologically so entrenched, you don't care about being alive at that point of time, because it's literally a military operation. All in all, with the point at which when you join hands with the Russian nexus and buy into their defense contracts and stuff like that, you lose legitimacy and your ideology fans over time. That means that you do not have the amount of ambitions that you can subscribe to, neither can you maintain the legitimacy of the Wagner Group. Both of those are incredibly detrimental to the actor for those reasons. Affirmative.
Across the floor, shake hands, best of luck. Yeah, if you want to check that on the screen.